Welcome, everyone. I'm Agustin Rayo. I'm the Kenan Sahin Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Thank you so much for joining us today to hear from Charles Stewart III, who is the Kenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science. Charles is one of our nation's premier experts on elections, on congressional politics, and on American political development. For over 20 years, he's been a leader in efforts to apply scientific analysis to questions about election technology, election administration, and election reform. In 2017, he established the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, and in 2020, he helped establish the Stanford-MIT Healthy Elections Project. Charles is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has been recognized with all sorts of teaching awards at MIT. And he and I have something in common, in addition to both being holders of Kenan Sahin chairs. We have both served as heads of house on campus, in his case, McCormick Hall. Charles's work truly epitomizes MIT's mission to address the nation's and the world's greatest challenges. Thank you, Charles, for being with us today. And before we begin, a quick note to the audience. The Zoom chat is closed, but you should have a Q&A button, which you can use to enter questions. And with that, Charles, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Augustine, for that very kind introduction. And I would add, since you noted our point of contact as heads of house, that I believe I was the chair of the search committee that brought you into that august group. And so that was the best afternoon or two that one of the best afternoons or two that I've spent at MIT. And so again, thanks for that introduction, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to share a screen and demonstrate to all of you that after 4 years of sharing screens, I'm pretty much incapable of doing it right. If I've done it wrong, I'm hoping that one of the folks from MIT will help to correct things. So my intention today is to not talk so much about the issues that are at stake in this coming election, although I'm certainly happy to talk about the horse race or American politics broadly in the Q&A, if that's what the audience would like. But what I want to do is focus on what I've mostly been focusing my attention on for the last couple of decades, which is the conduct of the election, and framing many of my comments in the context of what we were experiencing 4 years ago in the conduct of that election. And for those of you who have forgotten, I would just remind the audience, hopefully people aren't going to be too traumatized. I'm showing you the front page in the New York Times exactly 4 years ago today. And 4 years ago today, we were, of course, still wrestling with the pandemic. The Times here suggests that we were coming out of the pandemic, and how little did they know at the time that the pandemic was going to have even greater repercussions for American politics than the headline writers suggested at the time. Now, also my comments are going to be in part reflected in an article that I wrote for the Journal of Democracy back in April 2021 with my colleague Nate Persily, who's a law professor at the Stanford Law School, whom I joined with to create the Healthy Elections Project 4 years ago. And we wrote an article for the Journal of Democracy entitled "The Miracle and Tragedy of the 2020 Election." And the miracle, of course, reflects the fact that despite the challenges of voting in 2020. And remember, about this time 4 years ago, I was still fielding questions from reporters and very serious people about whether we would even have an election in 2020. And so the fact that we held an election that not only got through the pandemic, but I would argue is one of the most well-administered elections in American history, even before we apply difficulty points, that it ended up being, in many ways, a tragedy, given the way that the interpretation in much of the country has turned in really reflecting on not just the outcome, but also how we got to the outcome. So that's the miracle and tragedy of 2020. And I think for many people, the question is, well, what will 2024 be about? So in this talk, what I want to do is, first of all, before diving into this question, looking back at 2020 and then thinking about where we're going to be in this election, I want to say a few words about about the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, which I founded in 2017, and then go through the administrative, behavioral, political changes that running 2020 as an election happened, and then talk a bit about the prognosis of 2024, things that we're seeing right now as the election season begins to unfold. Now, so the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, which is abbreviated as MEDSL, I would encourage y'all, not in the next hour or so, but when the talk is over, to go to electionlab.mit.edu and discover what we're doing at MEDSL. You'll see that we do a number of things. You will also see, if you go to our About page, what our goals are. And our goals really are to be data-driven in analyzing elections, to be scientific in our analysis, and to be nonpartisan. In other words, we try to apply MIT's distinct way of approaching problems and issues to this issue of elections, which oftentimes is not addressed in the political arena, using science, using data, and trying to understand what true best practices are in a nonpartisan way. We do the best we can, and we've been pretty successful so far. If you go to our website, you will see the research that we're doing. I have a small staff. We have a lot of UROPs who work with us. We do traditional academic research. For instance, this article that just appeared in the journal Political Analysis about being able to buy votes potentially in ranked choice voting, to reports written for the government. The lessons learned from the 2020 election was a report written for the Election Assistance Commission. Surveys that we do, the survey of the performance of American elections is an important post-election survey that we run, where we ask 10,000 voters after every federal election how it went for them, and then explainers of all sorts of topics to educate the public about elections. We are the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, and we have a ton of data. Indeed, while we are recognized as a leader in scientific research and in outreach to the public, we also have a team of, teams of students mostly who work to produce data sets that are among the most widely used in political science. We have a data set on precinct level election returns that is a critical element to much of the citizen-based efforts around redistricting in the 2020 election. And then we not only do our own work, but we are at the hub of many experts around the country whom we can rely on for our own work, or we are happy to refer the public, members of the media, to our colleagues around the country who are well-versed in a variety of election-related issues and who work in a way that's very simpatico with us. As Augustine mentioned back in 2020 with my colleague Nate Persily, the law professor at Stanford, we started the Healthy Elections Project, which was the leading academic voice analyzing what was happening during the run-up to the election. And then we were also very active in working with the media and is sometimes actually with the courts to process what was happening after the election. You can see the URL there on the bottom of the page. And by the way, I'm happy to share the slides with the audience if you would like to have them. The slides will go by pretty quickly. And coming soon, we are going to re-up the old posse and soon start something very similar to the Healthy Elections Project that we are now branding the Stanford-MIT Elections Performance Central, where we will be doing, again, scientific analysis of dynamics of the election starting this summer and moving into Election Day and beyond. And the last thing I'd like to encourage you also to take a look at after this talk is it has a different URL, elections.mit.edu, the Elections Performance Index, in which we rate how well states have been running elections. And we do this after every federal election. Encourage you to go there. So let's come back to those heady days of 2020, 4 years ago. And first of all, just talk about the administrative and behavioral effects that the pandemic had on how we run elections. And the first thing, of course, was this rapid change in how Americans voted during the pandemic. 4 years ago tonight, 4 years ago today, we were at the end of a period where the presidential primaries had started, and immediately after Super Tuesday, immediately states shut down voting in light of the coronavirus spreading. And many states, both blue states and red states and purple states, put a stop to voting. And in some cases, they delayed their voting until way into the summer, to July and August. This is a graph that just helps to illustrate those delays. We have a timeline of when the primaries were scheduled in 2020. And you can see, and then we also have various golden bars that show when primaries actually were held. And starting in mid-March, there's a whole bunch of golden bars indicating that almost everyone delayed their primaries many, many weeks, in some cases, many, many months. So when they came back to voting, they were voting by mail, which is a really interesting thing, in part because prior to 2020, there were some states that did a lot of voting by mail, but most did not. The West did a lot of voting by mail. But aside really from kind of Colorado westward, most of the country voted in person, either on election day or during early voting. And almost immediately, states turned on a dime and they figured out how to get ballots to voters by the mail, which, by the way, I'm not going to get deeply into this, but that was an enormous logistical challenge to do that. And so what this graph shows is, if you can see the hollow circles, the percentage of ballots cast by mail in 2016, and the solid circles are the percentage of ballots cast by mail in the primaries in 2020. And you can see some states like Ohio. Ohio is an interesting case because Ohio, they shut down their voting on election day. And within a month, they had gotten mail ballots to everybody, and eventually 90% of the ballots cast in Ohio were cast by mail. And other states like Idaho and Maryland or Nevada that had not really been voting by mail, everybody's voting by mail. So really like turning on a dime, creating a new way of voting, at least in those states. Now, this period, the primary period, did not come off perfectly. During the summer, a number of challenges emerged that did not portend well for the fall. First of all, during the shift to voting by mail, we saw hundreds of thousands of ballots that were rejected in the primaries. Sometimes they arrived late. Sometimes they didn't have a signature on them or a date on the return envelope, things like that. So hundreds of thousands of ballots were rejected. If that kept up, there would have been millions of ballots rejected in November. There were worries about being able to recruit poll workers. Most poll workers are retirees. And there was great concern among the elderly about working, in polling places around people who might be infected. The Postal Service was seen as imploding. While there was emergency funds funneled into election offices to help with the pandemic, the consensus was that wasn't enough. And so in the summer, we were worried based on what we had seen in the primaries, okay? So nonetheless, once we got into the fall, we had a pretty good election. The big thing is that continuing on this theme of moving to vote by mail, we saw a dramatic increase in voting by mail. These timelines show, starting in 1996, the percentage of Americans who had voted election day, the blue, red by mail, green, in person before election day. And the timeline stops in 2018. And we see what 2020 looked like. For the first time in American history, the modal way of voting in the 2020 election was by mail, and less than a third of Americans voted on election day, whereas 60% had voted on election day as recently as 2018. Not only did a great number of voters vote by mail, they got their mail ballots in record speed, which was kind of interesting. Voters figured it out. Election departments figured out how to get the ballots to voters, and they figured out how to get them back quickly. And when those ballots came back, the mail ballot rejection rate plummeted. States figured out how to communicate with their voters about how to vote their absentee ballots or mail ballots properly. And the word just got out about how to do it properly. And voters in most states, New Mexico was an exception, I'm afraid to say, but voters in most states got the message and really came through. Now, a lot of mail balloting, but there was still in-person voting. So what did we see in in-person voting? Well, in voting in person, one of the things we saw was social distancing and other things that happened in the polling places to make voters feel safe. Poll workers wearing masks, hand sanitizer, social distancing, all these sorts of things that voters themselves reported seeing and that election officials spent hundreds of millions of dollars to ensure. When we asked voters after the election, how confident were they when they voted in person that they were protected from COVID-19, 90% responded that they felt either very or somewhat confident that they were not at risk when they went to vote. The other thing we do after the election, I mentioned this before, is that we interview 10,000 Americans about their experience on election day. I'm not going to ask you, this is kind of a detailed little graph here, but I'm going to tell you what the takeaway is from all of these flat lines. We ask voters a series of questions about their experience on election day. Did they have a problem with voter registration, with the voting equipment, with how well things were being run? Did they have good poll workers? And the interesting thing in 2020 is, if you look at those results, first of all, almost everybody said they had an excellent experience, did not have problems. And their experiences in 2020, when they reported them back to us, look indistinguishable from their experiences in other presidential elections. You would not have known that we had a pandemic, well, except for the fact that everyone was wearing masks. But the point is that people who went to vote on election day had a good experience. With respect to recruiting poll workers, compared to 2016, election officials reported it actually was much easier in 2020 to obtain poll workers than it had been in 2016. Not harder, easier. And they were able to recruit younger poll workers. Not young poll workers, to be clear. The age distribution got shifted from the 70s down into the 60s and the 50s. Nonetheless, we were able to shift the age curve. But there's always a but. One of those buts just had to do with, well, what happened after the election. And one of the things that happened after the election was there was a tremendous number of post-election lawsuits, over 60. And so there was, a lot of litigation afterwards. There was also a lot of election denialism, and efforts among local politicians to deal with the election skepticism. The Cyber Ninja episode in Arizona is probably the best known, but there were similar things happening around the country. There are all sorts of people on the internet making all sorts of math errors and kind of filling up the inner tubes, YouTube and other channels with specious types of analysis to show that the election was fraudulent. And of course, there were kind of communications and mass media in which there have been charges of defamation, and many of those lawsuits continue to this day. Okay. Now, let's think about the political effects. So we talked about administrative effects of 2020. How about the political effects? One of the things that I find interesting as a political scientist, looking back on 2020, is that the dynamics that most of the nation kind of observed in the summer, through the fall, especially the kind of polarization that we eventually saw over how to conduct the election. A lot of those dynamics got set early in the pandemic and then just grew over time. One of those dynamics is related to where the pandemic was hitting, early rather than late. If we take a look at where COVID-19 cases were hitting, and we divide the counties into those that eventually voted in favor of Biden versus those that favored Trump, we see that in the spring into the early summer, it was largely Democratic counties where the pandemic was hitting hard, not in Republican counties. That flipped as we got close to Election Day, but early on, when behavioral patterns were being set, COVID-19 was largely an urban phenomenon or a phenomenon that was occurring in rural African-American counties in the South. Not only that, but COVID early was way more deadly than COVID late. So Democratic counties in the fall, Democratic counties in the spring were experiencing many more cases and much more deadly cases than Republican areas. And what we've discovered since 2020 in a lot of research in political science and in public health and other social sciences is that the behavioral patterns for Americans responding to the pandemic really got set in April and May. So that by the time we came into the fall, voters in Democratic areas were behaving one way and voters in Republican areas were behaving in another way. That pattern got set in April and May from the early days of the pandemic. Not only that, but then there were politicians who were communicating about the election in partisan ways. Famously, then President Trump, was pushing back against the expansion of mail voting. Many people in his administration were also pushing back. Now, at the same time, Democrats were embracing, especially national Democrats, were embracing voting by mail. Particularly Ron Wyden, the senator from Oregon, became basically was beating the drums, trying to get America. In fact, one of the bills that was proposed would be to have required all of America to vote by mail. And so at the highest levels of our political system, we saw Democrats and Republicans duking it out over whether or not voting by mail was a good thing or a legitimate thing. And what we ended up seeing, of course, was the politicization of how Americans voted. So here's a graph that shows the percentage of voters on the left-hand graph, Democrats in blue, Republicans in red, who voted by mail in every federal election from 2006 until 2020. You can see on the left-hand side that up till 2018, Democrats were a little more likely to vote by mail than Republicans. In 2020, that exploded apart from each other. If we asked voters about fraud, their belief about fraud, prior to 2020, Republicans believed that absentee ballot fraud was more common than Democrats. But in 2020, not only did that gap remain, but it also flew apart. Democrats became much less likely to believe it was a common problem. Republicans more likely to believe it was a common problem. And then if we ask people about their favoring or opposing various types of voting reform, one question I've been asking for the last couple of decades now is whether people are in favor of all voting by mail. And we see that in 2020, what we see before 2020, Democrats were more likely to favor all voting by mail. But even Democrats prior to 2020 mostly were against it. By 2020, most Democrats came out in favor of everybody voting by mail and remained there. So this polarization, which in this case is mostly driven by Democrats, not by Republicans, but by Democrats. Okay, so that's kind of the administrative behavioral things. And we then have polarization as an attitude that was affected by things. Now, we measure confidence and trust in elections by these two very simple questions that we've been asking for the last quarter century. How confident are that your vote either was or will be counted as intended, depending on whether we ask this question before or after the election. It's sometimes called egotropic confidence. And then we ask people also if they're confident that votes in their city, their county, the state, or nationwide either were or would be counted as intended. Sociotropic confidence. Over the last quarter century, I've been studying this with many, many colleagues. If we just look at nationwide, how confident voters have been over the last quarter century, we see that voters have been much more confident that their own vote was counted as intended than being confident that votes nationwide have been counted as intended. But these numbers have been relatively flat for close to a quarter century. Interesting thing is that if we look at Republicans and Democrats, Republican confidence has been going down over the last quarter century, whereas Democratic confidence has been relatively flat, and it actually went way up in 2020. Okay, so some of the partisan kind of polarization that we've seen over elections recently, actually those seeds had already been planted before 2020. And then they were kind of, they got fertilized by the effects of the 2020 election. If we hone in just on 2018 and the 2020 elections, and we look at voters' confidence in their own vote, the county's vote, the state's vote, and the nation's vote, again, Democrats blue, Republicans red, we see between 2018 and 2020 this increasing polarization on this question as we move from people's own vote, which used to be, Democrats and Republicans used to basically give the same answers. That became a bit polarized, even more so for the county, big for the state, and a huge gaping polarization when we ask people about votes nationwide. To say a word about the states, because that's in some ways where we've had the most political activity. In 2016 and prior to 2020, mainly what we discovered is that Republicans were confident about their states' vote count when Republicans won, and in Republican states, and Democrats were more confident in Democratic states. It was just kind of read off of who was winning the elections in those states. In 2020, Democrats everywhere were confident, and Republicans everywhere lacked confidence in their state. Now, they didn't either lack confidence or gain confidence uniformly. And in fact, in 2020, this could be the right-hand side graph here, what we discover is that the biggest differences between Democrats and Republicans in confidence about their own state's voting administration and basically the legitimacy of the election, those sorts of things. They were greatest in the states where Donald Trump lost by a small amount. Kind of right at that 50-50 discontinuity line. Prior to 2020, there had always been a bit of a division, but in 2020, that division between narrowly winning and narrowly losing opened up really big. And the closer the election in 2020, the more dissatisfied Republican voters were, the more satisfied Democratic voters were in 2020. There was state legislation, state legislative effects. The number of bills introduced into state legislatures about elections increased in 2021 and 2022. However, the number of bills passed did not increase. So state legislators got in the act and started to discover that they could make hay by throwing bills in the hopper. And if we look at all the states around the country, we discover that in Democratic states over the last 3 years or so, Democratic state legislatures have expanded the access to the ballot, and Republican legislatures have restricted access to the ballot in different ways. In Republican and the restrictions have been things like outlawing private funding for elections, limiting drop boxes, and the rest. Expansive legislation has been around making permanent certain changes to voting by mail, expanding the access to drop boxes and those sorts of things. So, final thing I'll note is that in anticipating what's going to happen in 2024, we can look at 2022 and kind of get a preview. Because in 2022, we were already beginning to kind of move away from the kind of the heated rhetoric of 2020, and certainly the pandemic, to see how the system was re-equilibrating in light of the pandemic going away. So you've seen this graph before showing the collapse of election day voting in 2020. If we look at the graph now in 2022, most of the trends just basically kind of go to where more or less you would have expected them to go, given long-range trends. If we look at this graph these graphs that show the differences between Democrats and Republicans in the use of voting by mail, we see in 22 that Democrats still used mail ballots more than Republicans, but that gap had fallen. If we look at confidence levels, where basically we saw much greater polarization in 2020, we've seen Republicans actually returning to levels where they were in 2018, and Democrats continuing to be really confident. In fact, sometimes I refer to Democrats these days as being irrationally exuberant about the state of elections in America. But Republicans have bounced back. Democrats have stayed way up there. And if we look at this kind of what's happened in the purple states, we see that kind of the differences between Democrats and Republicans have kind of returned to kind of pre-2020 levels, with the exception of 2 states. And those 2 states are Wisconsin and Arizona, where the battles continue. Okay. So one final thing, and then I'll talk about 2024, is that, and this is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think it's really, really important for those of us, especially those of us who live on the coasts and don't travel a whole lot into the center part of the country. And that is, there is now a social movement that has arisen to try to stoke popular dissatisfaction with the state of election administration, especially the use of technology in elections, trying to encourage election officials to count ballots by hand. There's also increased intimidation of election officials, and I'll come back to this in a bit. And there's gotten to be a politicization of list maintenance in very interesting ways that I don't have time really to talk about here. Because I want to kind of end talking about the prognosis for 2024 before opening it up to questions. So what are we seeing in the primaries? We're right in the middle of the primary season. So far, turnout is way down. I mean, this is not, it was even before now, back in February and March, kind of everybody knew what the outcome was going to be. Right now, the only question around is how many votes will Nikki Haley get and how many votes will uncommitted get on the Democratic side. Turnout has been way down because of the decrease in competition in the primaries, and mail balloting continues to drop to kind of pre-pandemic levels. So there are concerns arising when you talk to election officials and when you read the news. For election officials, first of all, there's concern about violence against them. Many state legislatures have criminalized policy differences. In the past, if you went into court and you disagreed with how an election official was administering a law, the judge could basically just order the election official, if you won in court, to stop doing that. There's now many states where the judge not only can say stop doing that, but now has to throw the election official in jail. And so there's criminalization of policy differences. There's high turnover of election officials. And again, election officials are concerned about recruiting poll workers. There are movements in some states. Georgia has gotten a lot of attention to not just kind of challenge individual voters because we think maybe they've moved and shouldn't be allowed to vote in this jurisdiction, but efforts to blanket challenge tens or hundreds of thousands of voters at a time. And then there's also worry in the election administration community about generative AI, although I have to say that to the degree this is going to be active, it's probably not going to be such a big deal these days in election administration, but it may be a big deal in the campaigns. There's concern about pre-election litigation and having a chaotic scene going into November. So a lot of worry that there's going to be just a lot of litigation and causing chaos in the minds of voters. And it's kind of an inside thing to kind of watch in the news. A lot of lawyers and academic lawyers especially have been trying to get the courts to settle election disputes early so that the chaos doesn't reach over into the fall. So for instance, in many of y'all, in fact, I imagine most of y'all knew about the cases in Maine and Colorado that threw Donald Trump off the primary ballots there. And there was a very interesting amicus brief to the Supreme Court written by a politically mixed group of election lawyers who argued, regardless of which side the Supreme Court rules in this case, you got to rule now. Don't drag this thing out into the fall. Rule now so that we know what the rules are. Similarly, last week, there was a lot of news, with some news at least, about the redistricting plan in Louisiana. And the interesting thing there, kind of the inside baseball thing there, is that the Supreme Court made a ruling now rather than letting, they could have let the case move into the fall And they decided, again, the principle is we want to reduce chaos. We're going to rule now and let litigation continue maybe after the election. And certainly, there's likely to be litigation after this election. I know because I talk to Republicans and Democrats all the time, and both sides, if we think they were lawyered up in 2020, they're really lawyered up in 2024. The final thing I'll say, and I'll conclude, is that election officials are increasingly concerned, and many politicians are concerned about post-election violence. And actually election day violence, but also post-election violence. So that's something that I think all of us should be concerned about. So to conclude, wrap up, take some questions. I love talking about this stuff. On the question about running the election in 2024, from where I sit, and I talk to a lot of people, my team and I, we crunch a lot of numbers. We're on top of what's happening in all the states. Election officials were battle tested in 2020. They learned a lot in 2020. They've taken what they learned in 2020, they've applied it moving forward. Administratively, my sense is that elections are going to be pretty well managed in 2024. Many states have reverted back to the status quo prior to 2020, by the way. And my point about election administration being solid for 2024 hasn't been shaken by anything that I've seen either in 2022 or in the primary season so far. The most unpredictable factors may be worries about violence, potential election skepticism on both the left and the right, depending on the outcome of the election. These days, we tend to think about election skepticism being on the right. I was in a conversation today with somebody who kind of works both sides of the aisle, and they're beginning to kind of see kind of evidence of a nascent kind of some conspiracies arising on the left. So we'll have to watch that. There will be serious challenges in 2024, but I think 2020 shows that even when we have challenges to the administration elections in the United States, these challenges are not insurmountable. And then finally, I think one of the most important things we learned in 2020 is despite the political controversies about how we run elections and election skepticism, and it's in some cases even conspiracism, that the fact-based, evidence-based parts of the political system in the United States, especially the courts, have held. And at the trial court level and the appellate court level in the U.S., it looks like they continue to hold. And so while I'm kind of buckled in for maybe a wild ride after Election Day in November, one of the things that we're trying to do here at MIT and in my election lab is to be ready with the facts about how the election was conducted, and to be ready to communicate with the public and anybody else who wants to listen. So thank you for your time, and I'm delighted to turn it back over, I believe it's to Anne-Marie Michael, to take any questions that might be out there.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was terrific. I'm sure we could go on for a couple more hours at least, talking about this incredibly important topic. There's a bunch of questions. I was going to start with bundling a couple, which are about high technology and low technology, or different technologies. There's a question about using open source software for for voting systems versus these proprietary black boxes. With what you have opinions, or is there data on would that be would that make better system? And there's also a question really about the U.S. Post Service, and some concern about that it hasn't been there's mail that goes missing and it hasn't been accurate, and how does that fit in? I mean, I know you said that there's a lower voting in mail-in voting. Sorry. So, a little bit about those technologies, from software to actually putting a stamp on something and mailing it.
Yeah. So maybe high, medium, and low technologies.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is MIT, and I'm not surprised to get a question about open source, black box voting, and those sorts of things. So let me kind of give you a little bit of background, kind of where my kind of what informs my thinking, and then some hot takes on this. I got involved in this whole area of election administration back in 2000, and folks on the call will know exactly why many of us got involved in 2000. And Chuck Best at the time, helped to stand up a really cool interdisciplinary, intercampus project called the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, which continues to today, its effects resonate throughout the election system. And I got involved through the VTP. And so I've been thinking about this for a long time. And the second thing is that I was on Los Angeles County, starting about 15 years ago, redid its voting system and dedicated itself to constructing a voting system that was open source. And so I've, kind of been on the edges of probably the largest open source success so far. So what are a couple of quick things to say? And I'm, always happy to answer more things on email. First of all, there's clearly a cultural issue within election administration. For 150 years, security in elections, even back in the horse and buggy days, was really security through obscurity. And so there is a cultural aversion to open source within the election administration community because it goes back into the 1880s and 1890s. Keeping things secret from the bad guys is what they've always been doing, and to suggest that you would open up secrets to bad guys is an anathema to many people in the field. Now, in Los Angeles County, Dean Logan, who's the director of elections there, he has been dedicated to open source. One of the things I've discovered in that case is that it's easier said than done. And there are still kind of IP and other issues that arise when you dedicate yourself to open source. And Dean is still trying to figure out a good way to kind of make the software available. In part, one of the issues is he's just one guy, right? And how do you and the world is kind of dangerous, and one election official, against the world in trying to do this, it's not easier said than done. So I'm somebody who thinks that open source would be a bit better than security through obscurity, but we have a long way to go, I'm afraid. There for the voting machines, there's other parts of technologies, poll books, et cetera, that are more likely to be done by open source. One final thing. There's an MIT grad who has a system that is, I believe, open source. Benedita, I could be wrong with that. The other neat thing about Ben's case is that he's trying to put together a commercial off-the-shelf type of system as well. So there's some interesting things happening around the edges of the industry, but they're not mainstream yet. United States Postal Service. It was hurting 4 years ago, continues to hurt today. I think one of the unfortunate things in the states is that many states, particularly red states, have put restrictions on the use of drop boxes, even when they haven't restricted the use of mail ballots. And what's the problem there? Well, the problem there is that the drop boxes are more secure than mailboxes where you would leave your ballot. And they are picked up and they are managed by the elections office rather than, postal workers who do, really hard work and, have the weight of the federal government behind them. Nonetheless, you would think that in light of problems with the Postal Service and just concerns about security, that states would welcome drop boxes for mail ballots, and yet we're moving in the opposite direction in many, many states. If you're going to vote by mail, get your ballot in early. And if you need to request your ballot, request that ballot as soon as you can.
Great. Thank you so much. Here's a question. Can I, if you don't mind, can I take you away from voting to polling?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to comment on this, but one of our guests, one of our alum says, for normal citizens, there seems to be some sense of risk if they express their opinion in a poll inquiry. And this person has a hypothesis that, there might be a disproportionate number of blue voters not responding to polls. And that, it becomes difficult to use polls to measure. And that perhaps the popular vote will be different with more bluer than polls seem to indicate. These are some hypotheses. I don't know. Do you have some thoughts about polling? That seems to have really changed a lot.
Yeah, on this question, there again, there's another MIT alum named Andrew Gelman, and if I would encourage people to follow Andrew. He was an undergraduate, and is a really important social statistician. He blogs. It was either 4 or 8 years ago. He came up with a really interesting finding. I believe it was in 2016, where during the, if you were to follow kind of the time series in, let's say 2016, sometimes, Clinton is up, sometimes Clinton is down. Most of that movement was caused by differential non-response by Democrats and Republicans, right? So when something bad would happen to Clinton, again, let's say it was 2016, then you would see people that we kind of knew were Democrats being more likely not to respond, and people we knew were Republicans more likely to respond. And then when the shoe was on the other foot, you would see different non-response rates. And so, so there ends up being kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy during the campaign, especially the early campaign period, where the fluctuation is a combination of what core voters believe and whether they're demoralized or not. And that's one of the reasons why I don't pay really attention to the polls until somewhere around October 15th or 17th, because that becomes the point where kind of wishful thinking goes away, and people really begin to focus on the reality of the election coming up. So yeah. Now, I mean, these days, is it Democrats who are not responding, or is it Republicans not responding? My sense is probably it's Democrats, but there's a lot of reasons for Republicans not to respond too. So it's not clear to me that Donald Trump's, I mean, it might very well be that Donald Trump really, really is ahead right now, even if you could kind of push Democrats and Republicans to respond.
Thank you so much. There's a few questions that I just want to pull together around what kind of interesting demographic information you have about how people are voting. So people ask for mail-in voting, do you have details on, the age, gender, other details of who's doing it and not? Another question was very interesting. I just don't know if this is the kind of data that's collected, but someone asked, is there a difference in how much voting takes place, assisted living versus independent home? So I don't know if you have answers to those, but you might have other interesting data facts in how people are using mail-in and how people are voting. What groups maybe are voting less because of various issues.
Yeah. Just really quickly on like who votes by mail, and just a couple of things. First of all, if we were to dive deeper into the kind of the demographics, and I showed this graph, for instance, that showed that even before 2020, Democrats were voting by mail a little bit more than Republicans. That difference was driven entirely by the fact that it's largely Democratic states, California, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, that have all vote by mail. And so if you were to take those states out, Ds and Rs are much more likely to use voting by mail at the same rates. Similarly, in those kind of legacy vote by mail states, Ds and Rs are voting and using mail ballots at the same rates. So before 2020, the partisan difference was really a difference in opportunities to members of both parties, rather than one party really, was at least one party's voters favoring voting by mail over the other. With respect to race and age, a couple of things. Young people vote in person on election day. Inexperienced voters, older inexperienced voters, vote in person on election day. Voting by mail, unless everyone gets a mail ballot. Voting by mail is an acquired taste. It takes some, sophistication with bureaucracy in order to understand how to do it. So it's an acquired taste. Older people tend to vote by mail. Race was the most interesting thing in 2020, continues to today. While Democrats eventually were pushing, Democratic candidates were pushing their people to vote by mail, there ended up being a racial divide within the Democratic Party. Many African-American leaders resisted the move to voting by mail. And when I talk with them, it becomes really clear, among a group whose political memories are being denied the right to vote, the fact that we can go into a place and vote ourselves in body is a huge thing to this community. So that ended up being one of the ways in which race and party ended up being kind of working against each other in 2020 and continues to this day. Assisted living, we could talk a lot about assisted living. I mean, assisted living is one of those areas where people kind of worry a lot about fraud. They worry about, caretakers filling out, ballots for ballots for people in the facilities. There's certainly been stories about that. There are not numerous stories about that. There are many states, though, increasingly that are trying to limit or kind of put guardrails around voting in assisted living places. For instance, sending election staff to assisted living facilities in some states to do the voting rather than just mailing ballots to those places. So it's a very state-specific thing. Again, it doesn't appear to be a large number of votes. However, the optics oftentimes are bad, and a lot of states are addressing that issue.
Great, thank you. I think maybe I have one chance. Several people had questions about voter ID, requiring ID.
Yeah.
So I guess one is, what's data, if you compare localities that had the requirement or not. There's, a question, do in some cases, do mail-in ballots require some, ID, information? And finally, someone said, if voter ID was required for all voting, would that maybe increase the declining confidence in the accuracy of voting in the U.S.? So there's several kind of strands of voting ID question.
Yep. And I've done research on all of these. So here's the thing. Kind of the science on this is kind of when I was young, there was this comedy routine, a comedy group called the Firesign Theater. I think a number of people on this call will remember them. And one of their comedy albums was entitled "Everything You Know Is Wrong," and that's my sense about the claims people make about voter ID. On the confidence side, I've done. I and a few colleagues have done the research on what happens when you institute voter ID laws on confidence. It doesn't change confidence at all. Indeed, what happens is in states when the laws are proposed, the debate about voter ID reduces confidence. And so, as with all reforms, I caution against putting hopes on the reforms to increase confidence. I can go to other reforms. It doesn't change confidence. On the other side, and this is somebody who has worked as an expert witness opposing voter ID laws. The hardest question experts like myself have to answer is, well, if the laws are seen as a suppressive measure, why hasn't turnout gone down in this state? And you can list the state. That's a hard question to answer because empirically, the findings are that the number of people who fail to have IDs is really small in most states, and there's a lot more white people, white Republicans who don't have voter IDs than is commonly believed. And so racial effects are very muted. Political effects are very muted. And then finally, interestingly, when the first voter ID laws were rolled out in the late aughts, people who voted by mail were exempted. Increasingly, they're being brought back in those states. Georgia is a good example where that change has been made recently. And we're running out of time. We could have a long conversation about that.
Thank you so much again, Charles. I'm Anne-Marie Michael, the Assistant Dean for External Relations in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. I note that one of our guests asked if they could share this program. I'm going to check with the Alumni Association on the details of that. I've taken a note of the question and who asked it. We don't have time, unfortunately, because you were asked what your predictions are for 2024. So I guess if we had more time, you could tell us what's going to happen.
There will be an election.
Okay. We want to thank everyone for joining us and thank Charles.